2411 Flesh Weave. Sunny felt the final truth enter his body and infect it, spreading like a malignant code. The very nature of his mortal vessel was being changed and rewritten, his cells being torn apart and reassembled according to the new blueprint. The agony of being undone and rebuilt was simply appalling, making him stagger and fall. It was the opposite of the gentle process of evolution and renewal that Awakened experienced when attaining a new rank, violent, unnatural, and profoundly wrong. Sunny could feel that he was becoming something that he had never been meant to become, changing into something that he had never been meant to be. For the fourth time, the legacy of Weaver took root in his body, reshaping it. This time, the change mainly affected his flesh. His muscle tissue, tendons, internal organs. Everything was being reforged and tempered, becoming much more resilient and tenacious than before, full of inhuman vitality. How does this even make sense? He was a shadow now. An immaterial being who only possessed flesh when wishing to manifest as a human. So why the hell did it hurt so much? Sunny gritted his teeth and let out a tortured growl as his body was rebuilding and rearranging itself. It must have glanced quite monstrous to an outside observer. His muscles were rippling and twisting like snakes under his skin, and disgusting squelching noises were resounding from inside him. If there was one mercy, it was that he was not prone to bleeding, otherwise, the scene would have been immeasurably morbid on top of being deeply disgusting. Arg! Damnation! Sunny slammed his fist into the floor of the snow castle, sending a web of cracks running through the ice. But then, suddenly, his agony was washed away. A peculiar and subtly euphoric sensation overwhelmed him when fragments of the weave clicked together. Blood weave, bone weave, and flesh weave, the three parts of the nebulous demon's legacy responsible for the material vessel of their descendant, fused together, forming a synergetic whole. His heart was transformed and improved by the flesh weave, pumping his blood, which had been altered by blood weave. The blood flowed through the marrow, which had been enhanced by bone weave, becoming enriched and renewed. The human body was an intricate and interconnected machine, and now, each part of it had been altered, strengthened, and enhanced to resemble that of a higher being, of a demon, to be precise. There were other parts of him that worked in great synergy with each other now, as well. An additional boon was born from the fusion of the three corporeal fragments of the weave, flesh, bone, and blood. Sunny was renewed from head to toe. Even his skin, which had already been enhanced by the jade mantle, received a subtle overhaul. It was a full set. Well, the first part of the full set, at least. His broken arm was already regaining mobility. The grievous wound in his chest was healing rapidly. It was not only flesh that was repairing itself, either. The acquisition of flesh weave had served as a catalyst, and his bones were mending themselves as well. Sunny did not lose a lot of blood often, but if he did, more would be produced at greater speed. He let out a stifled laugh. Finally. He could finally call himself a tenacious cockroach with full confidence. What a feat! The transformation was coming to an end. Sunny exhaled slowly and sprawled on the ground, feeling the coldness of the ice soothe his heated body. He felt excellent, really. Remarkably strong, quick, agile, resilient, enduring. He was full of energy and brimming with vitality, his senses having turned sharper than before. The world was clear and crisp. It was clearly and crisply coming undone as the mountain shooken. Groaned around him. It was also straining to expel Sunny, the pressure rapidly mounting. Sunny, are you okay? Sunny turned his head and glanced at Kai, who loomed above him with a worried face. He raised a hand and formed a circle with his thumb and index finger. I'm fine. I'm great, actually. Kai let out a sigh of relief and smiled. He glanced at Sunny, wishing to say something. In the next moment, however, Kai's figure turned hazy and vanished, disappearing without a trace. Sunny stared at the empty space where Kai had stood a split second before absently, then turned his head to stare at the ceiling. He was sent back to the dream realm. Sunny would be expelled from Ariel's game soon, too. Now that he had gotten his prize, there was no reason to stick around. So, he inhaled deeply and waited to be banished from the artificial realm. As he did, Sunny could not help but think about what he had learned. About what Weaver had done. That damned demon. The magnitude of the truth that had been revealed to him was too great to fathom in a few short seconds. There was so much knowledge he had gained, and its nature was so world-shattering and shocking, too. His thoughts were scattered as a result. Weaver had not been killed by Slayer, despite what Sunny was led to believe by one of the previous truths. And yet, she did kill the demon of fate eventually, fulfilling her fate. She killed Weaver twice. Slayer, Orphne of the Nine, that was her name, even if she did not remember it. Curiously enough, Slayer had not forgotten her name during the innumerable years she had spent wandering the realm of death as a feral shadow. Instead, she had began to forget herself immediately after slaying Weaver for the first time, as if cursed as punishment for taking a demon's life. That first time might have been her own triumph. But the second time, Sunny was certain that the sinister demon had orchestrated their own ultimate death, or had at least foreseen it. Possibly even Weaver could not escape their fate, especially not when 9 fated paragons of doom were working to bring it about. But even if Weaver could not escape their inevitable demise, they could at least influence the tapestry of fate enough to design it. So how had the demon of fate died? And why? For what? Well, the answer was obvious, now. Weaver had revealed it to Sunny directly, no less. What was it the sinister demon had said, having foreseen that a person following in their footsteps would learn the truth of that moment one day, thousands of years in the future? Let me show you how gods die. Sunny's whisper was almost inaudible. Weaver had promised to show him how to kill the gods, and they did. Finally, Sunny knew the answer to the questions that had been plaguing him for a decade. How had the gods died? What had happened to the demons? Now, he knew. Weaver killed them. Weaver killed them all. A hoarse, unbelieving laugh escaped from his lips. 2412 Weaver's lullaby. It had been right in front of him the whole time. The description of Bone Weave said so. When children of the forgotten god rebelled against the gods, Weaver was the only one to refuse the call of war. Despised and hunted by both sides, they disappeared. No one knew where Weaver went and what they did, until it was too late. Where had Weaver gone and what had Weaver done? They had gone to create the nightmare spell. Sunny had been confused when he saw the final image of the vision shown to him by the sacrifice of the snow tyrant figure, but now he realized the truth. The vast void, the myriad of stars, then strings of silver light connecting them. What he had seen was the birth of the nightmare spell. Or rather, its evolution from an infant state to the universal force it was today. To Weaver's version of an absolute law. The many stars burning in the black void were the souls of living things. The smaller stars were the souls of humans, while the brighter ones belonged to spirits and deities. While most of them burned in lonesome solitude, some had already been connected by faint strings of silver light. Those were the souls of the first carriers of the infant nightmare spell, like Anenk and her people. Weaver had chosen priests among mortals first and sent them to spread the spell among the despairing refugees of the Doom War. In the chaos of the end of the world, it spread like wildfire, unnoticed and underestimated, laying a foundation for what would later become its final form. Slowly reached critical mass. All it needed to evolve into its true Tyrannical splendor, at that point, was a catalyst. And that catalyst was Weaver. Their death, to be precise. When Slayer killed the demon of fate in front of the Void Gate, which, apparently, was hidden in the heart of Shadow God, the 7 divine soul cores of the nebulous demon had become the anchors of the great spell woven out of strings of fate, completing it. No, rather, setting off its proliferation and completion. To truly become what it was meant to be, the great spell needed much more fuel than simply Weaver's soul. So, it devoured the gods. It devoured the demons, as well. The 11 radiant constellations Sunny saw being consumed by the vast tendrils of silver light were the 6 gods and the 5 remaining demons. By the time they realized what Weaver had done, it was already too late to stop it. So, their luminous divine soul cores became nods of the spell's weave, too. That was how the Doom War had ended. With Weaver casting a spell upon the void from beyond the grave. The void? No, the spell has not been cast upon the void. It had been cast upon the being who was slumbering in the void, and was supposed to awaken and consume all of existence once the gate of the void was open. Which it had been, even if Sunny still did not know who had opened them. He let out a stifled laugh. Unbelievable. The nightmare spell. Sunny had never seriously considered why it was called that. Whose nightmare was it that had given the spell its name? He had simply assumed that it was the nightmare of everyone infected by it, or at least living in the world where nightmare creatures and the spell run rampant and free. But Sunny had been wrong. In truth, it was the nightmare of the forgotten god. The nightmare spell was a lullaby. It was a sorcery created to lull the god of corruption back into slumber once someone, the 9, possibly, had opened the void gate and stirred him awake. Why had existence not been destroyed when the forgotten god was freed? It was because after escaping the void, he had been imprisoned somewhere else. He had been imprisoned in an endless nightmare. The forgotten god slumbered and saw dreams. The seeds of nightmare, the nightmare gates, the nightmare creatures, the spreading corruption. they were merely emanations of the nightmares he dreamed, slowly infecting what was left of the flame. Wait. Wait. Sunny's eyes widened. The implications were too vast and enormous for him to handle easily. The death of the gods, the end of the war, the purpose of the spell. Weaver's hidden intent. Sunny was not sure of his conclusions yet, but if he was right, then he could extrapolate and glimpse one final truth. He had always assumed that the sixth nightmare, the nightmare that would make those who conquered it divine, was the last one. But if the spell had been cast to lull the forgotten god to sleep, then there was one final nightmare after that. The seventh nightmare, where the forgotten god was imprisoned, dreaming restlessly. The conflict the challengers of that frightening nightmare were meant to solve was the conflict that plagued all of existence. The fate of the flame. I see now. The spell kept the forgotten god trapped within a nightmare. And at the same time, it ruthlessly nurtured mortals to become the new gods. And kill him. That was the truth of the dying world. Sunny remained motionless for a long while, and then sighed deeply. That's a little bit too ambitious, even for me. The demon of fate had promised to show him HOW to kill the gods. But really, Weaver could have just as well promised to show him how to create gods. That dastardly demon, and what the hell did Weaver call me? Epigon. The nerve. Bold words, coming from 1/7 of a deranged god. Sunny might have stumbled on the true purpose of Weaver's scheme, but that did not mean that he had to fulfill it. After all, killing the forgotten god was Weaver's goal, seemed to be Weaver's goal, at least. But it was not Sunny's goal, and neither was the goal of his comrades and companions. Of Nephis. Their goal was simply to make sure that humanity survived and build a new home for it in the dream realm. They had to become gods to accomplish that, but battling the forgotten god. While that would mean solving the root of the problem, it was also beyond what they wanted to accomplish. They wanted to build a shelter from the storms, not eradicate the concept of storms from existence. Who could have thought that becoming a god would become a modest goal, one day? Sunny smiled darkly. To hell with Weaver. They were not marionettes that danced when a dead demon pulled the strings. They would decide for themselves what they wanted to do, and what price they were willing to pay to achieve their goals. At that moment, the mountain shuddered violently one last time, and he felt himself being pushed out of the miniature realm of Ariel's game. The vast chamber of the snow palace disappeared, and for a moment, everything was dark. Or rather, everything was nothing and nowhere, beyond comprehension. Then, Sunny saw a vaguely familiar ceiling above him, and heard a very familiar voice. Well, look who finally decided to show up. Sunny groaned, feeling innumerable points of view and several weeks of memories crashing into his mind. It was his own voice, naturally. 2413 catching up with myself. Some time later, Sunny was in a magnificent council room of the Jade Palace, two of him, even. One was sitting on the shadow chair with his legs crossed, while the other was sprawled on a tastefully decadent couch, covering his face with a hand and groaning pitifully. Both were nursing a mighty headache. The incarnation on the chair was much better off than the other one, though. He was clean and neatly dressed, at least. His other self, the one who had just returned from a harrowing adventure in the realm of Ariel's game, was covered in layers upon layers of ash, soot, dried blood, and dirt of all kinds. The hole in his chest barely healed, and the scar where his severed arm had been reattached was yet to disappear completely. All in all, the sight of him was quite pathetic. The first incarnation was a little disheveled too, though. That was because its body had gone through the agonizing process of inheriting the flesh weave as well. All of them had, really. That bastard. Sunny gave himself a venomous look and shook his head. His other incarnation ignored him. Of course, the two of them were really a single person, once again, so whatever pain one of them felt, the other felt as well. The headache they were suffering from had been caused by the process of several weeks of isolated memories merging together. In fact, still, if Sunny had an opportunity to appear composed and nonchalant while simultaneously throwing a tantrum and drowning in self-pity, he would be a fool to pass it up. To his quiet dismay, the intended audience was ignoring his masterful performance completely. Sunny sighed. What a waste of a good tantrum. Nephis was paying him little attention, busy tending to Kai's wounds. Even though Sunny was almost entirely healed and even though he had caused the most severe of Kai's wounds himself, he was still unhappy with the lack of attention. Granted, the rest of the people gathered in the council room were all looking at him intently. One could even say that they were giving him death stares. To be fair, Seishan, Revel, and Hell had a reason to be unhappy with him. Sunny coughed. What do you have to ask? Even Cassie's voice was full of reproach. All those days ago, when one of his incarnations and Kai had vanished suddenly from the Tu room of the Jade Palace and left the startled Song sisters behind, 3 nightmare creatures took their place. To be precise, a cursed tyrant and 2 cursed beasts took their place. Sunny had already been moving his other incarnations toward Ravenheart, stunned by the sudden loss of connection to the naughty shadow, but he would have never made it to the Jade Palace in time. The 3 Song sisters could have died right there and then. But they didn't. Of course, they would have never been able to defeat a cursed tyrant, let alone one commanding 2 cursed beasts. Luckily, the narrow confines of the toy room bought them a few seconds to save themselves, and Seishan used those seconds quite cunningly. She lured the distressing creatures toward the Jade Queen's dollhouse, which swallowed them up just like it had swallowed her and her sisters decades ago. The cursed ones were still trapped inside of it. In fact, over the last 2 weeks, Sunny had spent numerous hours staring at the tiny figures of the detestable horrors wandering the gorgeously decorated rooms of the dollhouse. Someone had to guard the 2 harrowing toys, the dollhouse and the jade board, at all times, after all. So, Sunny had spent the better half of the month doing just that. After a while, Nephis joined him as well. They did not know what would come out of the jade board next, so having this much power concentrated in Ravenheart was a necessity. The missing incarnation remained lost, but it wasn't like they did not have any information about what it was doing at all. In fact, they could see the figures move across the game board twice a day just fine. Sunny could also feel every excruciating moment of his soul receiving damage, and saw new shades entering his soul sea from time to time. Powerful, harrowing shades. Oh, and then the shadow of condemnation went and vanished entirely. His dastardly avatar seemed to be having great fun out there all by himself. All of this culminated in Kai stumbling into the toy room out of thin air. Before Sunny could let out a sigh of relief, though, he found himself in utter agony, feeling his flesh rebuild and rearrange himself. And as soon as he recovered, the prodigal incarnation returned, flooding his mind with the memories of vicious battles, startling revelations, and truths so shocking that he was almost sent into a catatonic state. Luckily, he also regained memories of somewhat coming to terms with this new knowledge. Initially, at least, so that episode did not last long. Sunny looked at Nephis, then responded Cassie's mental question. I don't have to ask, but come on. They weren't even maimed that badly. How long do I have to spend in the doghouse? Whatever wounds the Song sisters had received were almost instantaneously healed by Nephis from a vast distance. That, too, was a reason they were alive and well. Sunny might have been a little reckless, but could he really be blamed? If Seishan had not told him about visiting the toy room numerous times as a kid and returning alive and more or less unscathed each time, he would have exercised more caution. Why would a sovereign be extra careful in a place where literal children used to play? Kai was fully healed by now, so Nephis left him and walked over to the head of the table. Sitting down, she studied Sunny for a while, both of them in turn, and opened her mouth to speak. Before she could, however, Death Singer spoke first. Look, there's 2 of them. Changing Star, can I have one? Please, pretty please. Nephis closed her mouth and stared at her silently. Her face remained expressionless, but the curtains behind Death Singer seemed to have suddenly caught on fire, for some reason. Ouch! Death Singer shook embers out of her hair and gave Nephis a sorrowful glare. Greedy. Nephis stared at her for a few more moments, then took a deep breath, extinguished the curtains with a thought, and glanced back to Sunny. So, what exactly happened? He smiled awkwardly. Well, do you want the short version or the long version? Nephis shrugged. Let's start with a short summary. Sunny scratched the back of his head. Okay, let's see. 2414 The Incredible Adventures and Astonishing Deeds of Heroic Dreamer Sunless and His Dashing Best Friend Nightingale, Abridged Volume 9. Sunny leaned back in his chair. He had a story to tell. And after having suffered through the story personally, he was going to enjoy himself telling it. He began off in a solemn tone. A long time ago, the Demon of Fate and the Demon of Dread played a game. Only, being insane bastards, they played with great and cursed nightmare creatures instead of game pieces. And, what would you know, Kai and I got sucked into the death game realm and given a choice between winning an unwinnable game or meeting our deaths. So, we went and won. Nephis sighed. A little bit less short, please. Seishan, meanwhile, glanced between them with a stunned expression. Excuse me, Demon of Fate, Demon of Dread. Cursed nightmare creatures. Sunny grinned. You're excused. Anyway, where do I begin? First, we eradicated a swarm of 100 great beasts. Then, we graduated to fighting cursed abominations. The first one we killed was an infinite worm. And I mean literally infinite. That thing seemed like trouble, but actually, it died when I simply stepped on it. Revel stared at him Foji a few seconds, then turned to Kai. Kai waved a hand weakly, still exhausted from the ordeal. His voice was faint. It's true, it's all true. Her eyes widened. No, but, however, Sunny interrupted her. So, next we found a cozy temple on the peak of a mystical mountain and waited to be beset by a pack of frightening wolves led by a cursed demon, as well as a very impressive training dummy. I was really hungry by then, but sadly, there was no wolf meat left by the time I was done with them. In fact, there was barely any mountain left as well. I sort of blew it up to smithereens. It was quite a sight. Nefis shifted slightly and gave him a strange look. You blew up a mountain? Sunny raised his chin. Sure did. He thought she would be proud of him, but for some reason, her gaze seemed a little dejected. If Sunny did not know any better, he would have thought that Nefis was pouting. But that was impossible, naturally. After all, she was Changing Star, the last daughter of the immortal flame. The fearless sovereign of humanity. Surely, she would not mind him stealing her signature move. Right, no way. Sunny cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, in any case. Next, we killed another cursed demon and 2 cursed monsters. How? To be honest, I don't actually remember, but it must have been in quite a spectacular fashion. Death Singer glanced at him, then at the other him laying on the couch with a miserable expression on his grimy, but unmistakably dashing, face. She raised an eyebrow. Wait a minute. How can you not remember slaying a cursed demon and 2 cursed monsters, though? Those were cursed nightmare creatures they were talking about. Actual deities. Sunny gave her his most sincere, innocent smile and shrugged nonchalantly. It must have slipped my mind. There was silence in the room for a while. Eventually, everyone turned to look at Kai in unison. Exposed to their gazes, Kai smiled awkwardly. Oh. Actually, I don't remember either. Nefis and the Song sisters seemed deeply betrayed by that statement. Their reproachful gazes were obviously saying, "You too, Nightingale, you too." Kai coughed and glanced away in embarrassment. Sunny chuckled. After that, though, something incredible happened. 4 gazes turned to him once again. He paused for a few seconds, and continued in a happy tone. We finally procured a meal. Well, at least I did. There was this cursed beast, you see, an endless swarm of rats. And I mean literally endless. Turns out, a cursed rat roasted over lava is simply delicious. Blighted, diseased, and poisonous, but nonetheless piquant and delectable. I positively stuffed myself, and can you blame me? Death Singer paled a little and moved away from the incarnation on the couch. Her mumble was almost inaudible, but it still made Nefis let out a long sigh. Quote. On second thought, you can have that one, Changing Star. He's all yours. Then, she glanced at the incineration on the chair and batted her eyelashes. Sunny wisely pretended not to notice. Now that I had a full stomach, it was finally time to take on the cursed tyrant. The cursed tyrant was an acquaintance of an acquaintance, as it turned out, quite a pleasant fellow, really. We had a nice chat. This time, it was Cassie's who interrupted him. You chatted with a cursed tyrant? Her voice seemed to tremble a little as it resounded in his head. Sunny smiled. Indeed, I did. We discussed refined topics like philosophy, theology, and peaceful resolution of violent conflicts. Sadly, our enlightened debate reached an impasse, so I cut off the cursed tyrant's head. He sighed and glanced into the distance thoughtfully. That, I find, is a surefire way to win an argument. The council room was filled with a stunned, incredulous silence for a long time. Sunny did not hurry to say anything else, either. At least for a while. Then, he glanced at his audience and smiled again. And here I am. He scratched the tip of his nose. Well, technically, I've been here all along. But you know what I mean. His smile widened. Nefis stared at him for some time, then rubbed her temples. Yes. Here you are. She hesitated for a moment, then glanced at Kai. Did he forget to mention anything? Kai considered the question seriously. I don't think so. Well, I guess. There was also that dragon. Nefis suddenly stood up, interrupting him. Actually, never mind. Let's continue this conversation later, shall we? Better yet. Forget I asked. Her gaze softened. You two must be awfully tired. Go wash off the grime of battle, eat a proper meal, and rest. There will be plenty of time tomorrow. Kai nodded in gratitude and rose to leave. Sunny stood up, as well. If you'll excuse me, then. Both of his incarnations headed for the door. The one covered in soot was let go, but the other one. Someone suddenly caught him by the collar. Turning around, Sunny was met by Neff's heated gaze. Not you. You stay here, if you will. I have a few questions to ask. Yes, I have a few questions to ask, too. Cassie's voice had an edge to it now. Sunny forced out a pleasant smile. Why, naturally, something was telling him that he was in for a long, restless night. At the same time, he found himself in a peculiar predicament. The events that had transpired in the world at large in these last few weeks were old news for him, but at the same time, he just learned about them. So, Sunny found himself in a strange state of being surprised and stunned by something he already knew. Rain. Did what? The incarnation who had just left the council room paused for a moment and covered its face with a palm. 2415 huge trouble. Everyone on the floor. This is a robbery. There was gunfire, screams, and the sound of breaking furniture as a group of masked men burst into the foyer of a prestigious bank. The startled clients froze, paralyzed by shock and fear. The workers raised their trembling hands into the air. The awakened security guards lunged forward while summoning their memories, but a few seconds later, they were already sprawled on the ground, groaning or unconscious. June should have known that his first mission as a member of the Shadow Clan would go terribly wrong. Ah, I hate amateurs. He had spent close to a month in the peaceful silence of the Dark City, being trained by the graceful Stone Devil, learning how to use the Mark of Shadows, and establishing bonds with other members of the Shadow Clan. Usually, a new recruit would have been given more time to adjust to their role and get used to things, but June was in somewhat of a unique position. His status as an elite among the black market operatives gave him a perfect cover to be seen in places where other members of the Shadow Clan could not enter without drawing attention, as well as a convenient reason to meddle in all kinds of unsavory business. So, he had been sent on a mission earlier than usual. And now, he found himself in the middle of a bank robbery. To be precise, June was wearing black combat fatigues, hiding his face behind an abomination mask, and holding an automatic rifle while watching his fellow robbers herd the hostages to the center of the foyer. The rest were breaking into the security system of the bank to activate the lockdown protocol. Having made sure that everyone was proceeding smoothly, he turned to the person who had fired a burst of bullets into the ceiling and regarded him chillingly. The man sensed his gaze and turned, asking in a hoarse voice. What? Instead of answering, June silently punched him in the solar plexus. His jab had not been telegraphed in any way and lacked a wind-up, so it did not seem very forceful. And yet, the awakened henchman folded in two and fell to his knees with a pained gasp, struggling to breathe. June calmly grabbed him by the hair, jerked his head upward, and asked in a chillingly calm tone. What are you doing? He pointed to the ceiling. Have you watched too many movies, moron? This bank is built to withstand nightmare gates. It is a box made from monster hide and reinforced alloy, so where do you think your bullets go when you start shooting randomly? Do you want to kill someone with a ricochet? The man hissed, trying to struggle free from his grasp, and glanced up at June with fury. However, that wrath was replaced with fear after meeting his cold, murderous, and eerily calm gaze. The enforcer shivered behind the snarling mask. Sorry, Corsair. June watched him for a second more, mentally reevaluating the situation. The people who had reached out to hire him for this job were not his usual clientele. They were not professionals assembling a crew of reliable specialists. Instead, they were zealots. Usually, June would not have taken such a contract, but the peculiar cult these zealots belonged to had been on the Shadow Clan's radar for a number of months now. This was their first serious move, so Awakened Kim had sent him to learn more about their goals and to make sure that nothing went wrong during the attack on the bank. In short, the robbers were a motley crew of a dozen or so believers and a few hired hands, June included. He was one of the more experienced people among them, so even the zealots seemed to be treating him with respect and trepidation. Still, maybe it was a good idea to make them respect him a little more. June glanced at the kneeling enforcer, considering if it was worth it to make an example out of him. Is there a problem here? He shifted his gaze and glanced at a delicate young woman with fair skin and blonde hair who had approached them. She was the only one of them dressed as a civilian and wearing no mask. Granted, she did change the color of her hair and the features of her face with a camouflage charm. She had been hiding among the clients of the bank when the attack started, looking weak and inconspicuous. That was why the guards had not paid the delicate young woman any attention and were taken down by her in a matter of moments as a result. Now that they were expertly tied up and under watch, she approached June. The young woman was another specialist hired by the Zealots. She was also his fellow shadow, Fleur. Ray was also here, posing as a mundane person and being restrained alongside other hostages. The three of them were sent on this mission together, with June taking charge. However, they were not supposed to show any sign that they knew each other prior to being hired to rob the bank. Fleur had to stay away from him to avoid drawing attention. June knew her well enough by now to know how competent she was despite being quite young, so there had to be a reason why she had gone against his instructions. Something was wrong. Letting go of the kneeling henchman, he wiped his hand on his fatigues and gave her a frigid look. No problem whatsoever. We were just having a friendly chat. Using the opportunity, the henchman scrambled away. Fleur studied June for a moment more, then nodded and turned away. Her delicate fingers, though, moved to form subtle signs. June glanced the other way, paying no attention to them. He did, however, sense the signs formed by the shadow of her fingers on the floor. We are in huge trouble. Maintaining a nonchalant attitude, he tensed inwardly. Look right. June did just that. The hostages were divided into two groups. The larger group consisted of mundane humans. Ray was among them, sitting on the floor with his hands tied behind his back. Despite being amateurs in June's eyes, the robbers were not, in fact, hapless. They had reliable means of identifying Awakened, it was just that Ray's aspect made most of such means useless. The smaller group, consisting of only a handful of people, was isolated to June's right. He glanced at them, immediately noticing two stunning young women, both handcuffed with special enchanted cuffs. His attention was not focused on them because of their beauty, naturally, but rather because both seemed much too calm for the situation they were in, which was not at all a good sign. June frowned, feeling a very bad premonition. One girl was of medium height, with tan skin and ashen hair, looking at the world with the imperious, cold gaze of a legacy scion. The other looked much more approachable, beguiling, even, looking around with lively curiosity in her gem-like onyx eyes and a slight smile playing on her soft lips. It was that easy, captivating smile that made it hard to look away from her. Well, that and the fact that she looked vaguely familiar. No, not just vaguely. Fair skin, raven black hair, the girl strongly reminded June of someone he knew all too well. His mouth was suddenly dry. Don't tell me. Fleur gave him another signal. Yes, that is the Princess of Shadows, Rain. Boss's little sister. June closed his eyes for a moment, remembering every curse word he knew. You gotta be kidding me. 2,416 can of worms. The assailants moved rapidly. Before too long, the bank's security system was in their hands, and the heavy armor plates meant to protect the building in case a nightmare gate opened nearby fell down, turning it into an impregnable, an inescapable, fortress. Of course, all things were relative. No thing was truly impregnable in the world of the nightmare spell. The bank could withstand the attacks of awakened abominations, and possibly a few fallen ones as well, but far more frightening creatures were entering the waking world more and more frequently these days. What seemed like reliable security measures just a few years ago were rapidly falling behind and becoming obsolete. The robbers were not really worried about fallen and corrupted abominations, either. What threatened them more were humans. Government forces would arrive at the scene soon enough, including powerful ascended officers. If their luck was especially bad, even a saint could show up to resolve the crisis. The chances of encountering someone they had no business encountering were especially high because this bank was an old and prestigious one, having existed from before the descent of the spell. Many prominent families, including storied legacy clans, used its vault to store precious heirlooms and priceless treasures. A concerned powerhouse could appear out of the blue, not out of a sense of duty or altruism, but simply to prevent their own family from being robbed. Ah, it's getting worse and worse. June sighed quietly. The presence of hostages would buy the robbers some time, but not enough time. They had to finish the job rapidly and get away before things went south. By now, the mundane clients and workers were tied up and sitting on the floor near the east wall of the foyer, while the awakened visitors and security guards were restrained and kept under watch near the west wall. Among them was the mysterious princess of the Shadow Clan. June threw a dark look at the gorgeous young woman and groaned inwardly. Blast it. On the day he joined the Shadow Clan, Awakened Kim warned him about three people, her husband, Aiko, and the princess. He had become good pals with Luster in no time and built rapport with the Shadow Fairy in no time. However, June had sworn to stay as far away from Boss's little sister as possible. He did not need to open that particular can of worms. And now here she was, in front of him. Locked, restrained, taken hostage, and surrounded by militant zealots. What was going to happen to June if even a single hair fell from her head? What was it that awakened Kim said? When it came to their boss, being killed was not an escape from suffering, it was merely the beginning. June had remained calm in many situations that would have made most awakened faint. He had survived horrors beyond imagination and glanced death in the eye without flinching on innumerable occasions. But now, he suddenly felt nervous. Forming subtle signs with his fingers, he sent Fleur a message. We must make sure that absolutely no harm comes to her. Fleur did not answer for a few seconds. And when she did, there was something peculiar about her response. Harm comes to her? No, Corsair, you don't understand. She turned faintly and gave him a peculiar look. You should be concerned about the zealots. Instead, we must make sure that Rain doesn't take them all out before we can complete our mission. Deciphering the ominous message, June raised an eyebrow behind his mask. Why, is there a possibility that she'll go on some kind of massacre? Fleur stared at him with an incredulous expression for a brief moment, then glanced away. Don't be silly, she's a pacifist. Now, what the hell was that supposed to mean? June would have loved to learn more, but at that moment, a man wearing a tyrant mask walked into the empty space between the two groups of hostages. His low voice resounded in the foyer of the bank, making a few of them flinch. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Tyrant. You have the honor of being my guests tonight. Show proper manners, and you'll have a pleasant visit. If not, his dreadful gaze landed on the hostages, forcing a few to reel back. I am afraid you won't enjoy the consequences. My people won't enjoy washing blood and viscera off our clothes, either, so do consider acting with decorum and following our instructions faithfully. Don't give me a reason to revoke my hospitality. The man was the lead ER of the group, a figure of prominence in the cult and a seasoned warrior, at least judging by what June had discerned about him. Worst of all, he was a master. June had taken down a master or two in the past, but it was never easy, especially when he did not have the advantage of striking from stealth or luring the adversary into an ambush. Assassinating an Ascended was one thing, but facing one in an honest battle was not something he ever wished to repeat. He just hoped that the princess would not draw the tyrant's attention. Nothing good would come if she did. As June was somberly contemplating contingencies, the dead silence that followed the tyrant's address was suddenly broken by a loud whisper. Wow, Tamar, did you hear that? That was a proper villain's speech, wasn't it? So cool. That guy is too full of himself, but let's give credit where credit is due, he's really eloquent, for a pompous dimwit, I mean. Rain, can you shut up? Please. Do you think he gave that speech impromptu, or had he rehearsed it at home? If it's the former, amazing. Great improvisational skills. I sort of think that it's the latter, though. Can you imagine? That'd be so funny, him standing in front of a mirror, practicing a sinister voice. Stop talking, fool, I'm begging you. No, I'm just saying. Do villains like that utter buffoon over there also get stage fright? I'd be mortified, having to give a speech in front of a hostile crowd. He has guts, that's for sure. Ah, you've done did it now. Huh, why is everyone looking at me? The loud whispers finally grew silent. Everyone in the bank, the robbers, the hostages, and the tyrant himself, were indeed staring at the two young women. The Princess of Shadow blinked a couple of times, then smiled awkwardly. Oh, was I too loud? Sorry. Continue as you were. June shook and suppressed the desire to shoot someone, possibly himself. In all his career as a soldier, mercenary, and occasionally an assassin. Arg, she's exactly like her brother. 2417 harmless, hilarious hostage. Rain glanced at the masked thugs and smiled innocently. That should be enough, right? Life was really unpredictable. Today was supposed to be a usual day, and yet, she had found herself in the middle of a bank robbery. Rain would have blamed her awful luck, but she suspected that luck had nothing to do with it. Rather, it must have been Tamar. She gave the legacy girl a sidelong glance. The two of them were visiting NQSC on business. Well, Rain was, while Tamar had come along as her friend and unofficial bodyguard. Chief Bethany had achieved a groundbreaking feat by establishing a hydroelectric plant in the dream realm, but she could not return to the waking world to share her research with the part of the academic community still residing here. If she did, she would be pulled into the first nightmare, so, an intermediary was needed to make a report on her behalf. Rain was the only awakened on the team, so she was a natural choice despite being an intern. She had been wanting to visit NQSC for the longest time, as well. This was where she had grown up, after all, but after leaving the city for Ravenheart numerous years ago, she never had the opportunity to return. So, Rain and Tamar used the Dream Gate to come back to the waking world. The conference where she was supposed to make the report was supposed to start in a few hours, but before they went to the venue, Tamar asked to visit the bank where her clan had a deposit box. And here they were, restrained and being stared down by a dozen armed assailants. Said assailants were staring at Rain with overflowing malice right now. Oh, was I too loud? Sorry. Continue as you were. She glanced at the leader of the bandits awkwardly. Of course, she had not just offended him for fun. Rain might have been young, but she knew people well. She had met all kinds of men and women, numerous of them at their worst or at their best. Crisis and war had a way of drawing out one's true nature, and both were plentiful in the world of the nightmare spell. So, having rapidly glimpsed the tyrant's true nature, she knew where things would go from the moment he began to speak. The callous man needed to make a crowd of frightened people submit to him. It was an imperative necessity if he wanted to emerge from this conflict with minimal losses. But frightened people were rarely rational. Mere threats were not going to work. If he knew what he was doing, and he seemed like someone who did, he would illustrate his promise of violence with something more convincing than words. She was certain that the tyrant was going to make an example out of someone, even if no one challenged his authority immediately. Their blood would prove his point and make the rest of the hostages believe his threats. That was why Rain had provoked the man. If someone had to be made an example of, it would be much better for her to play that role. Rain was an awakened, after all, and could endure much more punishment than one of the mundane hostages would. And if the tyrant went too far, she and Tamar could offer far more resistance. She was not arrogant enough to think that the two of them were invincible. In fact, in other circumstances, Rain might have acted with more caution. But she had noticed Ray among the hostages. Fleur was here, too, having infiltrated the criminal crew. Their disguises did not fool Rain, and after sensing them communicating with the shadow signs, she concluded that the tall man in the mask of a grotesque devil was a member of the Shadow Clan, as well. The mysterious devil emanated a sense of confidence and dreadful composure. She could not see his face, but his piercing blue eyes were cold and indifferent, as if he was not at all disturbed by the tense and potentially lethal situation. He seemed like a man with ice flowing through his veins. Rain did not know him, and he did not seem to recognize her either, so he was probably someone Sunny had recruited recent LU. Collecting unique people seemed to be his latest hobby. In any case, there were 5 members of Shadow Clan in the bank and 10 assailants, meaning that while Rain was indeed putting herself in danger, that danger was not too serious. 5 shadows was more than enough to handle this rabble. The only problem was the tyrant himself, who seemed to be a master. However, the magnitude of that problem remained to be seen. As the callous man turned his glassy gaze to her, Rain smiled and whispered 2 words almost inaudibly to assign herself a pair of epithets. I am harmless, hilarious promise of a distant sky. People were less likely to attack those they were not threatened by, and far more likely to treat those who made them laugh well. Now, she could only hope that the tyrant would not decide to go too hard on her. He studied her for a few seconds, then approached her with slow, measured steps and stared her down, making her shiver. Something was lacking from the man's gaze. Empathy, possibly, or possibly even humanity. I hope it won't hurt too much. But as long as the other hostages were spared, Rain was all right with hurting a little. To her relief, however, the tyrant suddenly let out a low, unnerving chuckle. Why, thank you, young lady. Eloquence is indeed something a man in my line of work needs to excel at. With that, he shifted his glassy gaze to Tamar. The tyrant remained silent for a moment, and then spoke in an even tone. Tamar of Sorrow. What a pleasant surprise. Legacies were no different from celebrities, so it was no surprise that he recognized her. Even if Clan Sorrow had lost its former prominence, numerous people would know what she looked like. The tyrant seemed to smile behind his mask, and then spoke over his shoulder in an emotionless voice. Corsair, take these young ladies down with us. It will be easier to get into the vault with them around. Rain let out a tiny sigh of relief and threw a glance at the tall man in the devil mask. Corsair. The newest member of the Shadow Clan was looking her way, as well. But why did it seem like he wanted to strangle her? 2,418 VIPs. The assailants moved with speed and discipline one would expect from well-trained soldiers, not thugs who would go around robbing banks. Before Rain could even come to terms with the shifting situation, she and Tamar were being escorted into the depths of the building. The tyrant was leading the way, with 6 of his men following. The 2 hostages were walking behind, with Corsair and Fleur guarding them. Which meant that 4 awakened bandits stayed behind to guard the rest of the hostages, and were now alone with Ray. Can we take them down? Rain and Tamar were restrained with enchanted cuffs that made their essence peculiarly sluggish and prevented them from summoning any memories. The former would have interfered with their ability to use Aspect's abilities if not for the Mark of Shadows. Every member of the Shadow Clan was a master at controlling essence due to bearing the mark and undergoing extensive training, so, they were all but immune to the insidious influence of the enchanted restraints. Rain had dismissed the epithets she had assigned herself to avoid the tyrant's wrath, and was now considering her next steps. First, she glanced at the rifles the assailants were carrying. It was strange to see awakened using contemporary weapons instead of memories. Sure, while it was difficult to seriously harm a master with a bullet, awakened themselves were far more susceptible to modern firearms. In fact, it was only marginally harder to kill them with a high-powered shot than it would be a mundane human. So, the rifles posed quite a real threat to Rain, Tamar, and the other shadows. Still, possibly because she had spent so many years in the dream realm, seeing awakened carrying modern weapons felt very peculiar. More than that, memories were simply a better choice, not only because they were deadlier, more powerful, and could possess potent enchantments, but also because they were far easier to carry and conceal. Rain signed a question. Why are you armed that way? It was Corsair who responded, hinting that he was in charge of this mission. Memories are unique, so they are easier to identify and trace. Anonymity is key in these matters. She considered his words for a moment. That was an unexpected but logical perspective. But the readiness of his response was a little peculiar. You seem to know a lot about this stuff. Robbed many banks recently, Corsair responded calmly. It was a weird thing, but after practicing for a while, one could discern tone and emotion in the movement of the other person's shadow when communicating with shadow signs. Fleur, for example, signed softly and smoothly. The new recruit, on the other hand, signed precisely and mechanically, with the measured indifference of a finely tuned machine. Opening square bracket dot. Not many. Rain and Tamar looked at each other. Where, exactly, had her brother found this guy? He was sort of cool. Wait, did he really rob a bank before? Come to think of it, there had indeed been a similar mission in the works. The assailants were descending into the basement of the bank, with one of them quickly unlocking the armored doors that stood in their way from a handheld console. They seemed well prepared for the job, even if locking themselves in a bank with the GovERN meant forces guaranteed to arrive and surround the building rapidly was pure madness. Rain signed another question. What is their plan, exactly? Corsair responded after a short pause. We were not told the details. One of them has a spatial movement aspect ability, though. He is their escape route. Single quote dot. Wait, he must be really new. How come he uses shadow signs so confidently, then? It took her ages to learn this peculiar manner of communication. Was this guy a genius? That was so unfair. Rain suppressed her envy and asked the final question. So, what do we do? Shall we take them down? Corsair shifted faintly, and she could feel his cold gaze. Please don't do anything yet, princess. At least not until they reveal all their cards. Rain frowned. It was reasonable to assume that the tyrant had an ace or two up his sleeve, but what if they hurt the hostages? His response was curt. They won't. She had no choice but to believe him. So, Corsair, Fleur, and Ray were here to spy on the assailants and learn something about them, then take them down. Which meant that these were not easy criminals. Rain wanted to scratch her head, but sadly, her hands were restrained. Who, then? Misguided loyalists refusing to accept the fall of the Valor and Song regime. Disciples of some strange doomsday cult. Several of those had sprouted out of nowhere after sister-in-law made her explosive announcement. Finally, they reached the vault. This one, the tyrant's tech specialist could not unlock, so, the leader of the assailants invited Tamar forward, gesturing to the complicated lock. If you will, Lady Tamar. She stared at him chillingly for a few seconds, then nodded to the lowest part of the contraption. Am I supposed to scan my fingerprints while my hands are tied behind my back? Her clan had a deposit box in the vault, so her data would be stored in the bank VIP client repository. That alone would probably not unlock the door, but it would help the tech specialist deceive the system. The robbers studied her silently. Finally, the tyrant pushed one of them forward. Take the cuffs off. Then, he turned his glassy gaze back to Tamar. Please don't do anything rash, young lady. If you do, I'll start with cutting off a finger. I know that you won't be deterred by such a easy threat. Legacies can be quite stubborn, after all, but do understand that I don't mean your finger. I mean you little friend over there, and it won't end with a single finger either. Rain instinctively clenched her fists, hiding her fingers. Tamar remained nonchalant, staring at the tyrant darkly, while Corsair tilted his head a little. Poor tyrant. He doesn't know what's coming for him. Rain almost pitied the man. The cuffs came off. Tamar walked over to the lock and unhurriedly scanned her retinas and fingerprints. Lastly, she channeled a little bit of her essence into a special spelltech pattern that lit up, recognizing it. Soon, the heavy door let out a series of low clicks and opened slowly. Far above, in the foyer of the bank, Ray was sitting on the floor among the frightened hostages. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, and there was an appropriately scared expression on his face. His eyes, however, hid a hint of boredom. The four robbers were watching the hostages like hawks, but no one seemed to be paying him much attention. Ray remained motionless, but, unnoticed by anyone, a black snake slowly slithered out of his sleeve. The snake coiled on the floor, then raised its triangular head. Its fangs bit into the zip tie, easily slicing it apart. Ray brought his hands forward and rubbed his wrists. Then, he reached back and picked up the snake gently. A moment later, its body rippled and turned into a razor-sharp black blade. Still ignored by everyone, Ray inhaled deeply and slowly rose from the ground. 2419 Bank Vault. Deep in the bowels of the heavily fortified bank, the colossal doors of the vault opened, and the tyrant led his men inside. Rain and Tamar were forced to follow, as well, finding themselves in a the bank vault looked nothing like what Rain had expected. In fact, it looked no different from a tastefully decorated, luxurious apartment. There was a spacious guest room with lavish furniture, video walls showing a scenic seaside landscape, and a sophisticated climate control system that imitated an invigorating breeze. Several doors led out of the guest room, opening into a gorgeously furnished kitchen, a neat and cozy bedroom, a recreation room with a state-of-the-art entertainment system, a stylish parlor. There was everything a person needed to live a comfortable life here, not having to step outside at all. A woman in a muted, but fashionable business attire was standing in the middle of the guest room, looking at the tyrant with a tense expression. What is going on? Rain looked at Tamar and Corsair furtively, but neither of them seemed surprised by the scene. The tyrant gave a nod, and his people dispersed across the luxurious vault apartment. Vault. The man himself, meanwhile, walked over to the woman and gave her his usual cold, glassy stare. He spoke first. Pleasure to meet you, Vault Keeper. Now I presume there is no point in expecting your willing cooperation. The woman shook her head somberly. The tyrant chuckled. Suit yourself. Torture it is, then. She gave him a cold smile. You seem to know your basics. Then you should know that people like me are employed for a reason, as well. My aspect makes me immune to pain, so try your worst. Rain finally understood what was happening. In hindsight, it was quite obvious. This bank was an old and prestigious one, offering its services to numerous prominent legacy families. And what was it that legacy clans would want to keep safe? Jewelry, precious materials, pieces of priceless art. Well, that too, but primarily, the most valuable assets legacies possessed were memories and echoes. Only awakened could own those, though. In case the heirs of a family had not undergone the awakening yet, a reliable intermediary was needed to make sure that they would receive their inheritance. Awakened led perilous lives, after all, and could die at any moment. Parents were not always able to transfer the aspect legact relics and valuable memories to their children themselves. Adult legacies were most likely in the habit of entrusting the heirlooms of their clan to a reliable, neutral party for safekeeping, especially before embarking on a life-threatening journey like challenging a nightmare or participating in a war, for example. Hence the need for the bank, and for the woman who was standing in front of the tyrant with a cold smile. He had called her the Vault Keeper, but more precisely, she was the vault. She was the awakened who kept the memories and echoes entrusted to the bank in her soul. That was why she was locked underground, living in the safety of this luxurious, heavily protected apartment. And just in case someone invaded the underground safe room, the Vault Keeper possessed an aspect that negated pain, and was therefore immune to more mundane forms of torture, making it that much harder to force her to transfer the memories and echoes against her will. But where there was a will, there was a way. Rain's expression darkened. There was probably an armored room with mundane deposit boxes somewhere here, as well, but that was not the tyrant's goal. His goal was the Vault Keeper. The man studied her silently for a moment, and then seemed to smile behind his mask. Bold words, but will you be responsible for them? We will see just how potent your aspect is soon, Vault Keeper. Are you truly immune to all pain? Does that encompass all physical pain, or do you not feel the agony of having your soul torn apart, either? What about fear? Do you not fear watching yourself be maimed and disfigured, even while not feeling anything? She pursed her lips, but remained silent, looking at him with a pale face. Yeah, no, I don't know what Corsair's mission is, but I am not going to watch an innocent woman be tortured right in front of my eyes. At that moment, the tyrant chuckled again. Well, no matter. As much as I'd love to test your limits, insolent fool, there is no time for that. So let me introduce you to my friend. Suddenly, a whirlwind of radiant sparks surrounded him. The whirlwind was too large to manifest into a memo-GY, which meant an echo. Suddenly, there was a sound of claws scraping against the floor. A grotesque creature appeared in the spacious room, towering above the humans. It was about 3 meters tall, with a gaunt torso and long, pale limbs. Its lower limbs were long and powerful, resembling that of a frog, while its upper limbs looked almost like that of a human, apart from their deathly pallor, eerie proportions, and clawed hands. The truly appalling part was its face, though. Disgusting. A mess of slithering tentacles hung from the creature's mouth, obscuring its chest. Its eyes were large and milky white, covered by cataracts, and there were fin-like ridges crowning its head. The whole thing was moist and glistening dimly, as if the creature had just crawled from a dark pool of stagnant water. From what Rain could tell, it was an echo of a fallen devil. The Vault Keeper took an involuntary step back, while Corsair took a lazy step forward, which just so happened to put him between Rain and the echo. Coincidentally, he almost bumped shoulders with Tamar, who had done the same. What is this thing? The Vault Keeper's voice was concerned. The tyrant craned his neck to look at his echo, and then turned around to the woman. This is a uniquely persuasive echo. Its powers affect the mind. Sadly, they also physically destroy the brain of the victim, but only after getting the victim to do what the master of the echo needs. So, Vault Keeper, you have a choice. You can either get to know my friend better, or hand over a memory called the Key of Ascension. Voluntarily, Rain lowered her head and prepared to manifest her mark into a weapon. At that moment, however, something unexpected happened. Just as lazily as he had come between her and the echo, Corsair took another step forward. And plunged a black stiletto into the back of the tyrant's skull. Or rather, tried to. Peculiarly enough, the sharp blade simply slid off the man's head, only leaving a shallow scratch on it. Time seemed to slow down for a moment. No, what the hell, time has literally slowed down. Corsair sighed. Ray, now. And then, everything around them was suddenly plunged into darkness. 2420 Uncharted territory. A few minutes earlier, Ray rose from the floor and studied the 4 awakened robbers guarding the hostages. His dormant aspect ability did not make him invisible, but it did make him hard to notice. People and nightmare creatures both paid him little attention, and his presence was very subtle. Still, there was a limit to that ability. He could take one of the bandits down, but unless he was careful, the rest would immediately notice it. Even if they did not notice Ray himself, they would see one of their own going down. His targets, after all, did not possess the same power. 4 of them, awakened, were unpredictable and often possessed tricky aspects, but usually, taking down 4 would not pose a problem to Ray, not after the training he had received in the Shadow Clan, at least. Taking them down quietly and while making sure that no hostage was harmed, however, was a different matter. He glanced at the black blade in his hand, then sighed and placed it on the ground. A moment later, Ray was gone. In seconds like these, his best friend was a distraction. Nothing happened for a dozen seconds, and then, one of the hostages suddenly reeled back and screamed. Snake, snake. The 4 robbers simultaneously turned to the source of the disturbance, aiming their rifles up. The man was awkwardly trying to crawl back, even though there was nothing in front of him. The robbers looked at each other and then headed toward him. Well, 3 of them did, at least. The one furthest away from the shouting hostage, and therefore behind the line of sight of his allies, suddenly found an arm wrapping around his neck. Ray got the man in a chokehold and squeezed with vicious strength, putting him to sleep. Since he made no noise whatsoever, and everyone's attention was focused on the frightened hostage, no one noticed him gently laying the unconscious robber on the floor. The other three, meanwhile, reached their destination. They glanced at the pale hostage, and then, one of them said in an angry tone. "Shut the hell up, moron. There's nothing here." The hostage, however, shook his head. No, there was a snake here just a moment ago. I swear." The robber sighed and opened his mouth to curse at the tied up man. It was then that a black snake suddenly slithered up his body and wrapped itself around his neck. Its mouth opened, and a chilling hiss resounded in the foyer. "What the?" The other robbers were starting to raise their rifles, but just then, Ray appeared near one of them, bringing down an alloy pipe, which he had scavenged nearby, onto his head. The man toppled like a tree, and by the time his partner jerked the barrel of the rifle in that direction, there was no one there. Ray's awakened ability, on the other hand, did allow him to become invisible, even if there were some limitations to that ability as well. In any case, he only needed half a second to reach the remaining robber, this time. Ray ruthlessly kicked him in the stomach, grabbed his rifle to prevent it from accidentally going off, and then slammed his knee into the man's chin as he bent down from the initial blow. By then, his mark had already dealt with the robber it had been strangling. All four bandits were down, laying on the floor in motionless heaps. The black snake slithered across the floor and climbed up his leg, disappearing into his sleeve a moment later. Ray looked at the hostages, who were staring at him in shock and fear. He remained still for a moment, then raised a hand and brought his index finger to his lips, as if telling them to be quiet. Then, he suddenly disappeared, leaving only four motionless bodies in his wake. Now, all he needed to do was get to the bank's grid control room and wait for Corsair's signal. Fleur was also in the vault, and while Ray was not happy about being separated from her during a dangerous mission, he knew that she could fend for herself. His sweetheart was a healer, yes, but she had received the same training he did. Plus, Rain and Tamar were there as well. Only I am stuck running boring chores. Sighing bitterly, he remembered the blueprints of the bank they had studied in advance and rushed to the grid control center. June listened to the exchange between the vault keeper and the tyrant without showing any interest in it. Of course, in truth, he was following the conversation quite intently. 6 awakened combatants, 1 master. The situation was not great, but it was not awful either. As long as the Ascended was taken down rapidly, the rest were not going to pose a problem. Of course, June was not going to attack the enemy master before learning what, exactly, had the man come here to steal. Then, the tyrant went and summoned a fallen echo. That spoiled June's mood somewhat, but not by much. Nothing really changed. Quickly killing the leader of the zealots was still his primary goal. When the tyrant died, his echo would disappear with him. His first mission as a member of the Shadow Clan was truly quite precarious. June was supposed to learn what the cult was searching for and take the zealots down, despite the fact that their leader was an Ascended. At the same time, he had to make sure that the hostages weren't hurt or at least not hurt too badly. The decision on how far the zealots were allowed to go was left to his discretion. Take the Vault Keeper, for example. Was he supposed to let the tyrant torture her? Or would that be crossing the line? Usually, June would have had strict parameters for a job, but the Shadow Clan gave its members a lot of autonomy. He was not merely a hired gun anymore, he was expected to exercise his own judgment and make decisions that would benefit the clan of his own accord. Which was already uncharted territory, and now there was also an unpredictable VIP added to the equation. The princess. Worse still, the adversary was in possession of a fallen echo. The question of whether or not June would allow the Vault Keeper to be tortured was moot now. The tyrant had decided to go straight for murder. The murderous zealot, meanwhile, was speaking once again. Quote. So, Vault Keeper, you have a choice. You can either get to know my friend better, or hand over a memory called the Key of Ascension voluntarily. June smiled faintly behind the mask. Ah, thank you kindly. The man just offered June the name of the memory the cult was searching for. Which meant that June did not need him alive anymore. Suppressing his killing intent, some enemies were quite sensitive to it. June took a step forward while manifesting his mark into a weapon and stabbed it into the tyrant's skull. There was no warning, no indication that he would attack. Just a rapid and ruthless strike that was supposed to end the zealot's life. But that was the thing about fighting Awakened. Awakened were very hard to predict. The second his weapon met the adversary's head, it felt as if he was trying to pierce metal. The bastard must have possessed a powerful defensive aspect. Well, crap. June activated his own Awakened ability, slowing down time. Ray. Now, somewhere far away, Ray heard his voice through a special communication memory shared between the 3 members of the team and cut the power. The artificial lights, the video walls, the climate control systems, everything in the vault that needed power to function was immediately disabled, plunging the spacious room into utter darkness. And darkness was the territory of the shadows.